Every prison has walls. Every prison has guards. But the most powerful control tool inside prison is something inmates are forced to accept 3 times a day. Not chains. Not isolation. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It quietly reshapes behavior, meal by meal, until resistance feels pointless. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. When people talk about prison punishment, they imagine violence, lockdowns, or solitary confinement. But psychologists and correctional researchers have identified a far subtler force at work, one that operates beneath awareness. Across U.S. state prisons, federal institutions, and comparable systems in the UK, Canada, and Europe, food is regulated not only for cost and nutrition, but for predictability, emotional neutrality, and behavioral stability. This documentary examines how controlled diets influence obedience, mood, aggression, and identity, and why prison food looks the way it does in nearly every system. This is not speculation. It's supported by decades of correctional psychology research. The science of control without force. Prisons are not chaotic environments by accident. They are engineered systems designed to minimize volatility. According to research funded by the National Institute of Justice, NIJ, institutions reduce violence not only through supervision, but through environmental regulation, including light, sound, routine, and diet. Food plays a central role in this structure. Correctional menus are intentionally repetitive, low in stimulation, balanced for caloric sufficiency, not pleasure, served at fixed times with minimal choice. Psychologist Dr. Craig Haney, known for his work on prison environments, explains that long-term exposure to highly controlled routines produces what he calls institutional adaptation, a psychological shift where individuals stop expecting autonomy. Food accelerates this process. When meals are predictable, emotionally flat, unchanging, the brain stops associating eating with reward. This matters because dopamine, the neurotransmitter tied to motivation and resistance, is heavily influenced by novelty and pleasure. Remove those elements consistently, and behavior becomes quieter, not because inmates agree, but because initiative erodes. A former inmate in a U.S. state facility described it this way during a post-release interview cited in correctional adjustment studies. After a while, you don't even complain about the food. You just eat it because that's what the day is. Breakfast, count, lunch, count, dinner. The food tells you what time it is. This isn't apathy. It's conditioning. Sociologist John Irwin, who studied prison social systems extensively, noted that routine meals become temporal anchors, markers that divide time and reduce psychological drift, while simultaneously discouraging disruption. When food becomes clockwork, so do people. Psychological consequence. The American Psychological Association, APA, has documented that environments with low sensory variation, limited choice, repetitive nourishment, increase compliance without increasing trust. That distinction is critical. Prisons are not designed to create satisfaction, they are designed to create manageability. And food is one of the safest tools to achieve it. No confrontation, no force, no headlines, just a tray placed through a slot. At this point, something begins to change, not immediately but gradually, in how inmates relate to themselves, to authority, and to time itself. And once that shift occurs, the effects extend far beyond the dining hall. Monotony, mood, and the quiet erosion of the self. Violence inside prison rarely begins with anger. More often, it begins with emotional flattening. Research reviewed by the American Psychological Association, APA, shows that prolonged exposure to monotonous environments leads to what psychologists call affective blunting, a reduction in emotional range. People feel less joy, but also less urgency, less hope, and less resistance. Food plays a crucial role in this process. In correctional facilities, meals are engineered to meet minimum nutritional requirements while avoiding sensory stimulation. Flavors are muted. Textures repeat. Variety is limited not because it is impossible, but because it introduces unpredictability. Predictability is stability. Stability is control. The neuropsychology of repetitive diet. Studies referenced by the National Institute of Justice, NIJ, indicate that dietary monotony reduces dopamine responsiveness over time. Dopamine is not merely a pleasure chemical. It governs motivation, anticipation, and decision-making. When dopamine signaling dulls, initiative declines, risk-taking decreases, emotional reactivity becomes muted. From an institutional perspective, this appears as calmer housing units. From a psychological perspective, it represents a narrowing of the inner life. The Chicago Crime Lab has found that environments with reduced sensory stimulation correlate with lower impulsive incidents, but also with increased depressive symptoms when exposure is prolonged. This is not accidental. It is a trade-off. Former inmates interviewed in longitudinal adjustment studies often report a shift in how they relate to food after several months. One individual, incarcerated in a large U.S. state prison, described it in a debrief conducted after release. You stop tasting it. It's fuel. If it fills you up, that's enough. Thinking about food just makes time slower. This statement aligns with findings from Craig Haney's prison psychology research. When a daily activity loses emotional meaning, it becomes a time management tool rather than a human experience. Meals no longer signal enjoyment. They signal survival. Aggression. Why less variety can mean fewer fights. It seems counterintuitive, but research cited by the NIJ suggests that highly stimulating environments increase short-term aggression in confined populations. Novel foods, strong flavors, or inconsistent meal schedules introduce microstressors that can escalate tensions. Correctional administrators understand this. By standardizing meals, expectations are managed. Disputes over fairness decrease. Competition is minimized. This does not eliminate violence, but it reduces volatility. However, the cost of reduced aggression is often emotional withdrawal. The APA notes that when individuals suppress emotional reactions to survive controlled environments, those emotions do not disappear, they are deferred. And deferred emotion has consequences. Depression and the loss of temporal identity. One of the most profound effects of dietary monotony is its impact on time perception. According to prison adjustment studies conducted in California facilities under the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, inmates exposed to rigid routines report days blending together, difficulty recalling weeks or months distinctly, reduced future-oriented thinking. Food, when unchanging, ceases to mark meaningful time. Without variation, there are no memorable days, no internal milestones, no anticipation. Psychologically, this creates what researchers describe as temporal flattening, the sense that life is happening to you rather than through you. Depression thrives in this condition. Institutional success, human cost. From a system standpoint, the model works. Facilities with strict dietary standardization often report fewer spontaneous disturbances, lower short-term aggression rates, increased compliance with daily routines. But compliance is not rehabilitation. John Owen warned that environments focused solely on manageability risk producing individuals who are less confrontational but also less prepared for autonomous decision-making after release. When food teaches passivity, it doesn't stop teaching once incarceration ends. By the time inmates recognize what has changed, it is no longer about taste or hunger. It is about how much of themselves has gone quiet just to endure the days. And this psychological quiet carries forward into parole hearings, reentry programs, and life outside the walls. When the control doesn't end at release. Release from prison is often described as freedom. But psychologically, release is not an ending. It is a transition from one environment to another with no decompression period. For many former inmates, the habits shaped inside prison do not disappear. They persist, quietly, in everyday decisions including how they eat, how they plan, and how they respond to choice. The shock of abundance. Researchers working with post-release populations, including studies cited by the Chicago Crime Lab, have documented what they call choice overload stress among formerly incarcerated individuals. After years of regulated meals, fixed times, limited options, no personal agency, sudden access to unlimited food options produces anxiety rather than relief. A former inmate released from a California facility described his first grocery store visit during a structured re-entry interview. "I just stood there. Too many brands. Too many colors. I left with nothing I needed and stuff I didn't even want." This reaction aligns with findings from APA research on institutional dependency. When autonomy is removed long-term, the return of choice can feel destabilizing. Eating without anticipation. Correctional psychologists have noted a recurring pattern in post-release behavior. Many former inmates continue to eat quickly, without enjoyment, and at rigid times, even when no schedule requires it. This is not habit alone. It is conditioned survival behavior. Dr. Craig Haney's work emphasizes that institutional routines reshape self-regulation systems. Food becomes functional, not relational. Eating is about efficiency, not satisfaction. Over time, this disconnect can contribute to disordered eating patterns, emotional numbing, difficulty recognizing hunger or fullness cues. The body has adapted to control. The mind follows. Long-term mood and motivation effects. Studies referenced by the NIJ indicate that formerly incarcerated individuals show elevated rates of depressive symptoms in the first year after release, even when housing and employment support are present. One contributing factor is the loss of structured predictability. Inside prison, meals anchor the day. Outside, time must be managed internally. Without those anchors, individuals report difficulty initiating tasks, low motivation, a sense of drifting. This is not laziness. It is the aftereffect of prolonged external regulation. Realistic post-release behavior. A participant in a community reentry program described the experience during an evaluation referenced in correctional transition literature. "In prison, you never decide when you eat. Out here, deciding feels like work. Sometimes I skip meals because thinking about it is exhausting." This reflects what John Irwin described as institutional carryover, behaviors that made sense inside prison but hinder adaptation outside. Food, once a stabilizer, becomes a reminder of lost structure. Why this matters for rehabilitation. Rehabilitation programs often focus on employment, housing, and substance use. Dietary behavior is rarely addressed. Yet psychologists argue that restoring healthy relationships with food and choice may be essential for rebuilding autonomy. The APA has emphasized that recovery from institutional environments requires gradual reintroduction of agency, not sudden exposure. Without it, former inmates may gravitate toward rigid routines, external control, or environments that replicate institutional predictability, including unstable work or relationships that limit autonomy. Prison food does not just shape behavior inside the walls. It leaves an imprint, subtle, durable, and rarely discussed. And until that imprint is understood, release will remain a doorway, not a destination. Control, compliance, and the illusion of order. Prisons often describe themselves as places of order. Schedules are precise. Movements are regulated. Meals arrive on time. But psychological order is not the same as human stability. Correctional systems rely on compliance metrics, fewer incidents, fewer disturbances, fewer reports. From that perspective, dietary control appears effective. Yet researchers warn that compliance can mask deeper psychological withdrawal. The National Institute of Justice, NIJ, has documented that environments emphasizing external regulation over internal self-control may suppress visible conflict while increasing internal disengagement. Food plays a subtle role in this dynamic. Compliance without consent. When inmates follow rules, it is often interpreted as cooperation. But psychologists distinguish between active compliance and passive submission. Active compliance involves understanding and agreement. Passive submission emerges when resistance feels pointless. Craig Haney's research highlights that institutional routines, including rigid meal structures, train individuals to conserve psychological energy. The goal becomes endurance, not engagement. Meals arrive. Rules are followed. But consent is never given. The role of fairness perception. One reason standardized prison food reduces conflict is its appearance of fairness. Everyone receives the same tray, the same portions, the same schedule. According to studies reviewed by the APA, perceived fairness lowers interpersonal tension, even when conditions are objectively harsh. But fairness without choice does not foster dignity. It fosters resignation. Inmates learn that outcomes are fixed, regardless of behavior. Over time, this erodes the link between effort and reward, a psychological pattern associated with learned helplessness. Realistic institutional behavior. In interviews conducted as part of correctional climate assessments, inmates often describe a shift in how they evaluate their own actions. One composite account drawn from multiple facility interviews captures the pattern. You stop asking why. The answer is always, because that's how it is. The food makes that clear every day. This reflects a broader institutional lesson. Questioning changes nothing. John Owen warned that prisons risk creating what he called managed passivity, individuals who function smoothly inside rigid systems but struggle in environments that require initiative. Order versus adaptability. From an administrative standpoint, dietary uniformity simplifies logistics and reduces liability. From a psychological standpoint, it narrows adaptability. The Chicago Crime Lab has noted that individuals exiting highly controlled environments often exhibit difficulty adjusting to unpredictable settings, a challenge linked to higher rates of recidivism. When food teaches predictability above all else, adaptability weakens. This creates a paradox. The system succeeds in maintaining order, but undermines the skills needed outside the system. Why this is rarely discussed. Food is seen as neutral, necessary, unremarkable. That perception shields it from scrutiny. Unlike solitary confinement or use of force policies, dietary regulation appears humane, even benevolent. Yet psychologists argue that its power lies precisely in its subtlety. It does not punish directly. It conditions quietly. And because it looks ordinary, it escapes ethical debate. Prison food is not designed to break people. It is designed to keep systems running smoothly. But smooth systems do not guarantee human readiness for freedom. And the more invisible the control, the harder it is to undo. When normality no longer feels safe. One of the least visible consequences of institutional control is not fear. It is discomfort with normal life. After prolonged incarceration, many individuals report that environments designed for freedom feel unstable, even threatening. This reaction is not irrational. It is the predictable result of long-term psychological conditioning. Food is one of the clearest signals of this shift. The psychology of safety through restriction. In prison, meals are limited, predictable, and externally controlled. Outside prison, food represents choice, impulse, and uncertainty. According to APA research on institutional adaptation, the brain begins to associate safety with constraint, not autonomy. Over time, restriction becomes familiar, and familiarity becomes comfort. This creates a psychological inversion. Freedom feels chaotic. Structure feels safe. Food becomes a symbol of this inversion. Former inmates often describe preferring the same meals repeatedly, fixed eating times, minimal variation, not because they lack imagination, but because variation demands emotional energy. Realistic post-release account, documented patterns. A participant in a reentry support program, interviewed during an adjustment assessment, explained it this way. When I eat the same thing every day, my head is quieter. When I try new stuff, it feels like too much. This aligns with findings referenced by the NIJ, which show that individuals exiting controlled environments often seek self-imposed routines to replicate institutional stability. Food becomes a coping mechanism. Why this matters for relationships? Eating is rarely a solitary act in free society. It is social, emotional, and symbolic. But institutional conditioning strips food of these meanings. John Owen noted that formerly incarcerated individuals may struggle with shared meals, family dinners, social gatherings, or restaurants, because these situations involve conversation, emotional presence. For someone conditioned to eat quickly, quietly, and without preference, these settings can trigger anxiety or withdrawal. The result is subtle isolation, not from rejection, but from misalignment. Control internalized. Perhaps the most profound outcome of prison dietary control is this. The system no longer needs to impose restriction. The individual does it themselves. Craig Haney emphasized that the deepest institutional impact occurs when external rules become internal expectations. At that point, the environment no longer needs to enforce compliance. It has already been learned. Meals are skipped. Variety is avoided. Pleasure is postponed indefinitely. Not as punishment, but as normal. The invisible barrier to reintegration. Reentry programs often measure success through employment, housing, and legal compliance. But psychological reintegration is harder to quantify. When normal life feels overwhelming, individuals may gravitate back toward environments that offer clear rules, predictable routines, limited choice. This is not a failure of character. It is the residue of conditioning. The Chicago Crime Lab has cautioned that without addressing these internalized patterns, recidivism risk remains, even when external supports are in place. Prison food does not follow people home physically, but the mindset it reinforces often does. And until that mindset is understood, freedom can feel less like opportunity and more like exposure. What food taught us about power? Prison food is rarely discussed because it looks ordinary. A tray, a schedule, a routine. But throughout this documentary, one truth becomes clear. Control does not always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as predictability, as repetition, as something so consistent that questioning it feels unnecessary. Food inside prison is not designed to harm. It is designed to stabilize systems. And in doing so, it quietly reshapes how people relate to choice, pleasure, time, and themselves. The research is clear. The experiences are consistent. And the outcome is complex. Reduced violence can coexist with emotional withdrawal. Order can exist alongside long-term psychological cost. None of this means prisons operate with malicious intent. It means institutions prioritize manageability, often at the expense of inner autonomy. And autonomy, once diminished, is not easily restored. When former inmates struggle with freedom, it is rarely because they cannot survive. It is because survival was all they were trained for. Understanding this does not excuse harm. It does not romanticize incarceration. It simply asks us to look more closely at the systems we accept as neutral. Because what looks like a meal can function as a lesson about power, about compliance, and about how quietly behavior can be shaped. If this documentary changed the way you think about prisons, psychology, or institutional control, consider subscribing. Not for algorithms, but for deeper conversations that don't rely on noise to reveal the truth. Some forms of power don't announce themselves. They just show up on a tray. And most people never notice.